for gay or straight or any other kind of age of consent. She just felt should be the same. And so I was rather with her on this, and almost didn't matter what the age was as long as it was equal, it seemed to me. But I remember addressing in Westminster Hall a group of people, and I said this thing that I trot out from time to time about when do you know you're gay, and that I remember when I was born looking up and saying, well, that's the last time I'm going up one of those. And
that's such a bad gag.
It's terrible, isn't it? I'm ashamed. But the point was...
It's also verbally wrong, of course, because you didn't go up it.
No, part of me did, yeah. But the real thing that I said, and I'm convinced is true, there were a lot of MPs saying, what gay people do, is that what's shocking about love is never the physical part of it, it's the emotional part of it. It's not... People may do all kinds of things with their bodies, which may or may not disgust or alarm one, but it's how much of themselves they subsume in another person is something quite extraordinary. And it's so, it's the subject of most films and most songs, and yet it's so extraordinary that we never stop to contemplate how bizarre it is that's what we give ourselves to. And that is the secret of almost every human being you meet. If you meet someone who is an utter turd, and in life you will, you only... Don't do that thing they tell you is, imagine them all naked, and then you'll have contempt for them. That's not the point. Imagine the absolute truth of even the most aggressive, unpleasant, self-regarding, vain, unsympathetic person you could ever meet, and remember that they are not only desperate to be loved, but they are desperate to love. And I've never met a human being of whom that isn't true. And it's so astonishing that we don't even bother to think about it because it's almost too much for our brains to take in, I think. Anyway, sorry. There we are. I'll cover it later.
Folk music.
Folk music, yeah. Oh, you remember, I did the Britannia Awards, Folk Britannia or whatever, awards for the... I'm very fond of folk music, and I think... as always, like Martin Amis, who's been on this stage many times...
Are you getting a little obsessed?
What, with Martin Amis?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was. He's a great writer. Well, yes. But resistance to the cliché is an important thing. And when I was starting out in comedy, it always annoyed me when I saw comedians doing things that other comedians did, but not only that other comedians did, that anybody in a bar could do. So that if you said folk music, they'd just go like that. And you go, that is the cheapest, it's like the equivalent of pornography in comedy. It's just like just touching a sort of comic G-spot that is unworthy. That really, the comedian I'd respect is the one who came on and said, isn't folk music great? And make it funny that it was great. Because the idea that all it is Morris dancers. Folk music is the music of roots music. You have to change the name to make people like it. But some of the most talented musicians, Kate Roosby, people like that, in Britain are folk musicians. And the music is deep and it's complex and it's exciting and it's unusual. I won't say that it's automatically better than any other kind of music, but that it is most certainly worth listening to. Yeah.
Genome. Where would one scroll you back to on your way to the Congo 2,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago?
Oh, me? Gosh. Well, I mean, John Lennon, we're all peasants as far as I can tell, I think was John Lennon's line. I'm lucky enough to have done, which I'm sure many people would love to, that BBC programme, Who Do You Think You Are, where you can at least go back to some extent in your roots. But again, the devilish part of me, although I'm very interested in the Fry family, and I was very interested in my mother's family. You know that old story about the invention of chess and how the emperor who had commissioned the best minds in the empire to come up with a game that was both fair, didn't give an advantage by luck, but also was complex. And this game inventor came up with chess, and the emperor said, "This is so brilliant, I'm going to give you any reward you want." And the inventor said, "Well, you see this board, it's 8 squares by 8 squares. If you could put a grain of rice on the first square, and put 2 on the next square, and then 4, and then ate, I'll take all the rice and that you fill the chessboard with. And the emperor thought, well, I got away with that easily, didn't I? And of course, he hadn't got halfway before it became apparent that this was more rice than there was in the world. And that is the power of exponential curves, of the arithmetical progression of numbers. And it's the same with us and parents. We have 2 parents and 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1,024, etc. Yeah, it soon becomes a gigantic number in a very short time, such that it is obvious we have, if you have any English blood in you at all, for example, choose England, then you must be directly descended from William II, if not from Henry III, a later one, because you have more ancestors going back then than the population of the country. So you must. There's no possibility that you aren't, even allowing for quite a lot of incest. And yet you meet someone who's called Bridgeworth, and they'll say, oh yes, there have been Bridgeworths in this part of Sussex for 200 years. And you say, well, 200 years, you have thousands of ancestors. And each one of them is as responsible for your existence as any other. The fact that we happen to live in a society that chooses the patronym, the one male that holds the surname, doesn't mean you're more related to them. If any one of those thousands didn't exist, you wouldn't exist. Now, this becomes important in a sort of xeno-philosophical way, in an ethical way. And in fact, going back to Cambridge, and E.M. Forster wrote a wonderful essay called On Jew Consciousness in the very early 30s, around the time of the ascension of Hitler and Nazism and the rather accepted face of anti-Semitism. He said, I'm not here in this essay, he said, I'm not going to argue about whether or not anti-Semitism is moral or immoral. I have my views on that, but let's just look at one side of it, about whether or not Jews are a stain and a bad thing. He said, let's take the best-known family in the world. He said, I would submit that is the House of Windsor. So let's look at the Prince of Wales, as he then was, the great Prince of Wales. David became Edward VIII. I do not believe that even the Prince of Wales could name his 8 great-grandparents, let alone his 16 great-great-grandparents. And if he can't, from the most famous family in the world, then how can any of us name our 8 great-grandparents? And if one of them is Jewish, or even a part Jewish, we wouldn't exist but for Jews. It is up to those who say, let's cleanse the race of Jews, first to prove that they aren't Jewish, and they won't be able to. The fact is we are so miscegenated. And that's really the point about genomes, is, the idea, what do we base our identity on? It's really interesting. And when I was in Kenya filming in November last year, it was the American election, and it happened to be the time that Obama won it. And I was filming, and there was some people from the same tribe that Obama's father came from, and they said, I said to them, God, you must be very excited that America's got a black president, and he's Kenyan. He said, yes, but remember, if he had been the same man, had stayed in Kenya and become president of Kenya, he would have been our first white president.